so other students can learn. And Xinyue Zhao is your chapter secretary, and she organized this workshop, and she'll be fielding the question and answer. Last 3 or 4 years, I discussed with Xiaoyu Qi and Denang Huang, your past chapter presidents, about the visa workshop, and they thought this was their most important issue for the chapter. And with school and COVID, we were never able to pull off the workshop. And now they're off in the other Washington state and then France too. So with a lot of help, finally we're here. So I'm going to get a little bit of an outsider's view of the international service and career services. There's been a little, and then I'll talk a little bit about employers' perspective on visa and sponsorship. Next, we'll have 2 alumni talk about their stories. And then we have Hiba Anver, who will talk about the nuts and bolts of the legal process, not the employer's perspective. And then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. So the International Service Office, when you work with them, I'm sure you've all had contact with them for your student visa status and stuff. It's good to make a timed appointment with them. I've tried dropping in, and my appointments were dropped, but I only have an N of 2. So the three things the International Service Office mainly deals with you as far as visas and stuff is, while you're a student, for getting an internship, you have to get the internship outside of the ISO, but they handle what's the curriculum practical training that authorizes you to be able to do the internship. And this is supposed to be part of your training and in your field, not to get a job, but those internships are really important because they give you an idea of the work environment, collaboration, and things that are totally different environment than school. And then a lot of companies hire interns because you become a known quantity. Then after graduation, and this is after a bachelor's, after a master's, and PhD, you can also do optional practical training, OPT, and for doctorates, that could be like a postdoc. And so that's extra training. And even though it's after graduation, you still have to work with the ISO office because it has to do with your student status. And since data science and statistics is in a STEM field, you can get a 2-year extension on that. Then they also now handle H-1B sponsorship for faculty and staff. So we're going to talk about that today, because if you're looking for an academic position in another university, the process should be similar at other universities. Okay, so ISO services, they handle orientation and adjustment. And basically that's, you get the campus tour and you get tours of DC, and then they do immigration support, which is what I just talked to. And they also do tax seminars. And the reason for that is you can get paid for these internships, which means you would pay US taxes. So they have events that do workshops and stuff. So here's some of their programs. As you can see, the tours and then the immigration support. I guess that's why they felt they didn't have to come to this workshop, is they do their own events. And since they're doing it in grand ballrooms and stuff, they must be pretty crowded. They also do these networking webinars, Network Night, which is also done with career service and alumni relations, but it's international, all international students. And then how to do a job search and interviews. And then they have social things among different international students. So I want you just to get an idea of this. So back to our, let me get back to the seminar. There we go. Okay. Now, while I was planning this, I also came in contact with career service and alumni services, and this is for all students. And these people reached out, gave me good information. And I just want to show you the difference about what. So this is for all students. And, instead of a desk, you have people talking to people here. They do career coaching, resumes, a lot of the same things that the International Services Office do, but they're doing it in a much more detailed. So it may be a little uncomfortable to work with, the regular students, but they would give you a lot more fuller services, like career exploration content, stuff that's specific to your stuff that's specific to your industry, like statistics and so on. And then, so I sort of look at ISO as sort of the shallow end. And then if you want to be a little more uncomfortable and step out, it would be really important to use this. And if they would be really happy to do a workshop for the student chapter and stuff like that. And they're, at least from my outside perspective, they're a lot more accessible. So okay, so let me get back to this. There we go. Okay. And then I'm not going to bounce back. Alumni services, once you graduate, you can become an alumni. And the importance of alumni services are they have mentoring, sort of the more you succeed, the more alumni has better services and the more success the university has, and making networking connections with the general alumni, not just other international students, gives you a broader network for your career. And if you think about it, you've come from another country and you're working across cultures, so you have more advantage of already being out of your comfort zone and working as you get into the mainstream of US culture. Okay, so Hiba is going to cover this a little later, but I also wanted to just give you a perspective. When you're making a decision about jobs, in some ways, the employer's making a decision about you, and you're also making a decision of whether you want to work for that employer. And different companies have a different perspective about sponsoring employees for sponsorship. I mean, on the positive side, this gives them access to a world of talent, and if they have specific niches they may not be able to fulfill with a US citizen, having a foreign student as an employee can fill those needs. That diversity also brings broader skills, perspective, and experience. Also, too, for a lot of times, foreigners will work for lower pay. So one thing, it's really important that you network, look around to see what people are being paid for the skills you have. And if you're bringing skills, going back to point one, that they can't get in other places, then you're a more valuable employee. So if you do your research, you can understand that and feel confident negotiating better salary, investment, and work experience. So on the negative side, the smaller companies may not feel they need to hire foreign workers, go through all the trouble of getting legal help and going through the sponsorship process, because they can just work with domestic workers for better or not. And then they don't have to spend the time on that expense. Also, too, going through the legal process to do the H-1B visa and sponsorship is, long and a lot of forms and complicated, but it's relatively straightforward. But there is a lottery cap, and there's a risk of spending 3 years training an employee, giving them the experience, and then maybe losing them for that. So that's usually the big risk for employers. And for Indian and Chinese students, sort of the H-1B visa process tends to be a lot longer. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it off to Xiang Li, and so welcome her, and she's going to tell her story. And she also is the Washington Statistical Society Student Travel Award winner. So I'd like you to encourage those of you that are still students to apply for that award. So welcome.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. My name is Xiang. It's a great honor to be here today to provide some information that I could help with everyone with their working sponsorship process. So today I will talk about 3 things. The first thing, a little bit about my background, and the second thing is a few options I know about how to get the working sponsorship. And the third thing is like my experience of interacting with the ISO and the employer to get the working sponsorship. So first, a background about me. So I went to George Washington University Statistics Department. I did my master and PhD there, and I graduated last year in August. And after I graduated, I just started working for a company in the DMV area. So the second thing is a few options I know about getting the working sponsorship. So when I graduated last year, there are a few options. Like the first one is you can go to some non-profit research organizations like FDA or NIH. So you would get those so-called non-cap H1B. So you don't have to participate in the H1B lottery. You are guaranteed to get a H1B non-cap H1B sponsorship if you work for those research organizations as a researcher. And the second option is that if you're working in the academia, like being a PhD student for a few years, you may already have some publications, and you may already have some citations of your publications. In that sense, you can just apply for the type of visa called NIW EB1, that for those very outstanding and advanced researchers. So you can skip the H1B part. You can just apply for those visa directly. And the third option is that if you are going to work in the industry, you have to participate in this called CAP H1B. So you have to participate in the H1B lottery to this, and if you got selected for the lottery, you will get the sponsorship by your employer. And about the third option, getting the sponsorship H1B from your employer, we know that if you're in a STEM program, like the statistics or mathematics, computer science, you will have 3 years working period with your F1 OPT. So which means like every year, you get a chance to be selected by the H1B lottery. You have 3 chances in total. But one thing I want to emphasize that actually you can get a 4th chance of participating in this H1B lottery. That's before your graduation. So after graduation, you get 3 chances, but before your graduation, depending on your employer and the timing, you can get another chance of participating in this H1B lottery. So how it works basically is that, for example, if you are going to graduate next year in May, and you are guaranteed to get a degree, or you already have some qualified degree by May or June next year, and because the H1B lottery is done every year in March, and you already get an offer before next March, then depends on your employer, they can sponsor you for the H1B lottery in May before you graduate. So that's another chance you can get, but that's all depends on your employer and the timing of when you get your degree. So that's the second part I want to talk about, a few options you have about getting the sponsorship. And the third thing I want to talk about is my experience interacting with the ISO and the employer to get into the H1B lottery. So if we want to legally work and use our F1 OPT, we have to apply for this so-called employment authorized documentation. It's called EAD card. There are some restrictions about when and how you can apply the EAD. So I highly recommend participating in the ISO OPT workshop. So you will get questions clarified about the timeline of the EAD application. You cannot apply EAD too early or too late around your graduation date. And also you have to be keeping in mind that once you have the EAD card, you have to make sure your unemployment days cannot be longer than 2 months. So taking all that into account, the best option, like strategy to apply for EAD, is to have a good plan about your next steps. So you have to have a good plan about when you about to graduate and when you about to get a job offer, when you start working for your employer, and based on that timeline, you decide when to apply for the EAD card. And also EAD card might take 1 month or so to process. So that sounds a little bit complicated. So I highly recommend to talk with ISO and participate in their OPT workshop. And in terms of working with my employer to get a working sponsorship, so once I have this EAD card, I can start legally working for the employer, and they are going to process the next step of apply for the H-1B lottery. It depends on the company because they're going to apply, like process many applicants at the same time. So they have their own timeline about when you have to submit certain documentation and like some other requirements to fulfill. So that part you have to talk with your employer about how to prepare for the H-1B lottery. And that's all the 3 things I want to share today, and hope that's helpful for people who are joining today.
All right, thank you, Xiang. And now we have Wenjing Xu, and she works for Loop Incorporated. So welcome. And you could put on your video again. Hi, Wenjing. You can put on your video and unmute. Yes. Welcome. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I dropped a little bit. So I can start my story, right?
Yes, please,
Okay.
please go ahead.
Let me share my screen. So I'm just going to talk about my personal journey. I'm not yet finished yet. I'm still in the process of getting a green card. And my path is a little bit
You could
tricky.
use Control L to make it full screen.
Is it better this way?
Just go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I graduated in 2013, and I think like many other students, I obtained OPT before graduation, and then I started my first job right after getting my degree, and then started talking to my employer about green card sponsorship, and then at that time, I encountered something called sponsorship cost reimbursement agreement. And I think it will be helpful to keep this in mind. What it does is sometimes, well, legal is expensive. So some company, for their retention, they want the employees which they're sponsoring for green card will sign agreement. What it does is after you hit a certain step, and then if you leave the company, you're gonna make the reimbursement to the company. Basically, you're gonna pay out your pocket for the legal fee they have spent on you. And also around the same time, I realized maybe the first job is not I want to do for my next few years. So to avoid any incurring legal fees, I decided to switch to a second job where I started the green card process over there. So I went through the prevailing wage perm and then got my I-140 and then be able to get my priority date locked. But then again, so I think I'm the type that I don't settle just for the sake of green card. So around that time, I decided to switch to a different industry. But bearing this in mind, I have been on my H-1B for about 5 years. Because for H-1B, the maximum it's 6 years, even though there are ways to extend beyond 6 years. But I think that's depending on like what status, or like whether you filed perm, when you filed perm, whether you have I-140. But I think Hiba have more to say about that because she's a legal expert. So after my second job, I switched to a third job where I encountered the same thing about the reimbursement agreement. And then finally, after that, I decided to move to my current job, which is the fourth one. So at this point, I'm way beyond 6 years. Because I switch jobs too frequently, and every time when I switch job, and I was still early on in my green card process, so I have to restart the green card process, meaning I have to the employer has to do the prevailing wage, perm, and other stuff from the beginning. So, and the entire process currently, I think what I heard is at least 1.5 years with no interruptions. So if it goes smooth, probably it's 1.5 years once you start the prevailing wage determination, and then later on you can file your I-140. And then because of the entire process is very complicated, and one lesson I learned is even though attorneys, they know what they're doing, but because they're dealing with so many immigration cases so many times, and then also oftentimes they have paralegal to help with the paperwork. So they might not pay more attention than you expect them to. So down the line, there might be mistakes. So lesson learned is just take control of your own case, review everything. Like even though there might be some silly questions, I think ask questions is always the best. So what happened to me is my current job location is in DC area, but because the company I'm working for has a headquarters in Chicago, because for the perm prevailing wage, I think at the prevailing wage determination stage, they need to put out the advertisement, show Department of Labor that they cannot hire a qualified American for my position. But keep in mind, this is a location specific. So at that time, I think the paralegal made assumption that my actual working location is in Chicago. So they did the advertisement in the Chicago metropolitan area, which is actually not the fact. So I think maybe after 1 year, I finally I found out about this, and then they decided to restart the entire process again. But I was already way beyond 6 year maximum H-1B, and it was difficult for me to extend my H-1B again. So what I decided is to start my NIW process, which is based on your research work. You have to show immigration that your work is having, sorry, I need to quit this. It's like qualified as national interest waiver. So I reached out to Professor Pan, asking her for her help, or write a recommendation letter for me, and also with the help of my immigration attorney I hired outside. So I was able to go through the process, and then got my I-140 approved, and use my priority date to file the I-485. So I'm still in the journey, but it's a very complicated journey. So one thing I learned is just take control and pay attention to your case. I think you are the person who knows your situation the best, and don't solely relying on the attorney the company hired. And if it's possible, try to consult with other outside attorney, get their opinion. And sometimes maybe legal fee is costly, but I think down the road it will be worth it. So this is my story.
Thank you, Wenjing. Those are important lessons to keep track and monitor where you are in the sponsorship process, and ask those what even you think are silly questions so that you understand where you are. And now we have Hiba Anver, and she's from the Erickson Immigration Group, and she's also a professor at the law school here. She was one of the volunteers from the American Immigrant Lawyers Association. So thank you, and she'll tell us the nuts and bolts of the legal aspects. Go ahead. And
Sure. So thank you to everyone, first of all, for sharing your stories. And I hope that I can supplement the stories and experiences with, as Mark mentioned, the nuts and bolts of immigration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very, very high level overview, and then we're going to do a very tight zoom in on the part of this process that is the most relevant to the folks on this call. And then hopefully, we'll have plenty of time left over for Q&A so that everyone has a chance to ask their questions. So the employer-sponsored immigration process, 9 times out of 10, is a 3-step process, okay? 3 steps. Step 1, perm. Step 2, I-140. Step 3, green card, okay? Depending on your country of birth and the category in which your employer classifies you, though that will determine how early in the process you're actually eligible to apply for the green card, okay? This is something known as a priority date. The reason I'm bringing this up is because oftentimes the majority of the folks that we work with are from the countries of either India or China, and are people who face some of the longest wait times before they're actually eligible to apply for a green card. And as a result, their immigration strategy in terms of what they're doing in the interim and how they're maintaining their underlying status needs to be very solid and very airtight, so that they are not in a situation where they potentially run out of employment authorization while they're waiting for that green card to finally either arrive or finally be eligible to file for it in the first place. So what I mean when I say, what are you maintaining in the interim while you're actually waiting for that green card next milestone? What I mean by that is, what is your source of underlying employment authorization that you are relying on in order to work for a US company and live and work in the United States that is completely separate and apart from your green card process? Those are known as non-immigrant visas, okay? And for students, the journey starts here with what we're getting ready to talk about. So the first source of employment authorization for a student is something called CPT, okay? It's curricular practical training. Now, this slide here has the nuts and bolts of curricular practical training, but here's the most important thing that you need to remember about the CPT option. One is, this is for folks who are still in school, okay? You can be eligible for CPT if you're able to demonstrate that this is a critical and relevant part of your education, okay? The other most important thing that you need to remember about CPT is you have to be very, very careful about how long you're on it and how many hours you're working on it, okay? Because if you end up maxing out how much time you spend on CPT, that's going to impact the type of employment authorization you could potentially be eligible for after you graduate. So I'm starting in that way because I want everybody to have some clear takeaways and some recommendations before we get into the nuts and bolts, okay? So to recap, CPT is for folks who are still in school, okay? You have to show that this is a critical part of your education or your curriculum, and you need to make sure that you are monitoring how long you're actually on it so that it doesn't affect your ability to qualify for employment authorization sources after you graduate, right? At a high level, The CPT option for employment authorization is really for folks who are applying for internships or some sort of maybe like summer internship or clerkship. Most of the time, we're talking about part-time employment, but you can get paid. It could be paid or unpaid. And this is one area where you really, really need to work very closely with your ISO or your DSO, basically your student advisor, because your document, the I-20, which is kind of like the seminal status document, if you're here as an F1, needs to be updated to reflect the fact that you are indeed authorized to engage in CPT employment, okay? So that is the first one. The second one, I'm going to call this, I'm not going to say that this is the most important, okay? But I want everyone to kind of think of this option as your first conduit, like your first bridge to a non-immigrant visa on which you will ultimately, hopefully rely as you pursue the green card process in the United States, okay? And that is OPT, or optional practical training. OPT is for folks who have already graduated, be it with a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD, okay? And it is something that is relevant to your field, but you don't necessarily have to show that it's critical or super related or relevant to like your education, like the degree that you're trying to obtain. And it's only valid for 12 months. Okay, OPTs are only valid for 12 months. So you as the student need to ask some questions of your international advisor, namely, when do I apply? When do I get it? When do my 12 months start, right? So that I can track my expiration date, because your immigration strategy is going to depend very much on your OPT dates, okay? So this is an area that you need to pay attention to very, very closely. But you know, you can work part-time, you can work full-time. In my area of practice, what I see is, I think the most common example is, you know, folks that are graduating either with a bachelor's or master's and really using OPT for when they get that first job, right? So we're not really talking about like internships as much like we would if we were talking about CPT, but it's not uncommon for some of like the larger companies, particularly in the tech space, to offer very entry-level positions to new graduates and have those graduates start working pursuant to this OPT. And that's why I say you want to look at this as your first bridge, right, into actually having a full-time job and then, you know, building your career and pursuing the green card process. As always, you need to make sure that you're getting that updated I-20 from your international office. Okay, but one key difference between the CPT and the OPT is when you start working on a OPT, you're actually going to get an employment authorization card. You're going to get a completely separate card that is going to serve as the source of your employment authorization, in addition to whatever additional notations or modifications are made to your I-20. And when you onboard with your future employer, the work authorization documents that you would be presenting, say, for example, you know, for I-9 purposes, would also include your EAD, okay? And then finally, you have something called a STEM extension, okay? The STEM extension is a great benefit for students who happen to be majoring in STEM fields, because if you qualify according to the list that the government, you know, the State Department maintains, if your degree code is one that is recognized by the State Department as being a STEM field, then in addition to the 12 months of OPT, you're eligible to apply for an additional 2 years of employment authorization, taking your total ability to work in the United States as a student or a recent graduate to 3 years, okay? So what you would do is you would make sure to work with your international office, your student advisor, on ascertaining the proper timing for filing for a STEM extension and understanding whether, you know, your office will help, you know, guide you through the process, whether they want you to retain an attorney of your own, whether, they have other suggestions, but you want to make sure that you ascertain the timing so that you can file for a STEM extension and have it approved and in hand so that you can kind of avoid any sort of a gap in between the expiration of your OPT and the start date of your STEM extension. Any gap between your OPT and STEM EAD is not necessarily going to stop you from continuously working, but it may have an impact on international travel plans and whatnot. So my recommendation to my clients is always play it as safe as possible, be as conservative as possible, and time it so that you can bridge any gap. Okay. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I want to take a step back and put this together in a way that helps you understand why I'm putting so much of an emphasis on timeline. Okay. The next visa that folks will most likely be eligible for at the end of their student status employment authorization journey is going to be the H-1B. Okay. Now I'm couching this statement, in a way because there are some visas that are available to individuals from certain countries. There's a TN visa for folks from Canada, Mexico. There's a visa for folks from Australia. There's a visa for folks from Singapore or Chile, right? But those are only a handful of countries. The vast majority of foreign students, when they come to the end of their journey on either OPT, CPT, STEM extension, will apply for an H-1B visa as their resource if they wish to continue to live and work in the United States and they wish to continue to work for this company or maybe build a career, right? But as I'm sure everyone is aware, perhaps painfully aware on this call, the H-1B is a lottery, right? There's no guarantee that you're going to be selected in the lottery, and demand far outweighs supply, right? So understanding your timing and understanding what options are available to you is part and parcel of the strategy that you discuss with your employer when you, as Wenjing, mentioned, take control of your own immigration destiny, right? So let's say, for example, you are working for a company. I'll just say, let's just say, for example, you're working for Google, right? And you get an internship with them while you have your CPT and you're either working part-time or maybe you just have like a summer internship, right? And you start to get the sense that your hiring manager and, the team is really taking a liking to you, and you think you have a chance at like a long-term career or like a full-time offer. Start talking to them about whether they'd be willing to put you in the lottery, right? Because if you're CPT, then you have limited employment authorization for the duration while you're in school, right? Once you graduate, you only have 12 months of OPT, right? And if you happen to be majoring in STEM, you can add an additional 2 years. But the mistake that a lot of people make is they use up their CPT, OPT, and then as they approach the end of their STEM, their employer starts to say, okay, now we will enter you in the lottery. Well, what happens if you don't get selected, right? You literally just used up all of your employment authorization resources and options available to you, and you applied very, very late in this journey and you didn't get selected, right? So if you are working with 1 year or if you're working with 3 years, the conversation you should be having with your employer is, please enter me in the lottery at the earliest possible date, because if you're not selected 1 year, then you participate the next year and see if you can increase your chances of being selected. And then you participate the next year and increase your chances of getting selected. The goal should be that you use your OPT plus CPT to turn into, at a minimum, 2 attempts at the H-1B lottery. Okay, at a minimum. So I want everyone to kind of like keep that in mind and don't be afraid to ask for that. And I'll also tell you, as somebody who practices, and represents the private sector, for the most part with larger tech companies, that's also very much like the norm. Nobody's going to be like shocked that you make that request. Okay. So that's the main takeaway that I want everyone to have from, the CPT, OPT, and STEM slides. But I also want to touch on H-1B sponsorship for faculty. So the reason that this is not being discussed in the same tone as when we talk about, the H-1B being a lottery is because in some instances, universities, research institutions, nonprofits are classified as something called CAP exempt. And what that means is that a future employer who happens to fit the definition of CAP exempt can still sponsor you for an H-1B, but does not have to put you through the uncertainty, or rather, let me rephrase that. You would not have to experience the uncertainty of a lottery, because CAP exempt means that you're not subject to a lottery. Because there are so few like institutions, and there's a number of other reasons for why it's separated, but the H-1B process can be different and a little less uncertain if the position that you are being offered that is the basis of the H-1B happens to be from a qualifying institution that fits the definition of CAP exempt. So say, for example, you do end up pursuing a career in academia, you want to become a professor, you can potentially benefit from a less certain process is what I would say to that. So I think that is probably where I will stop my portion in terms of, a high level overview of CPT, OPT, STEM, and, CAP exempt H's, which we've discussed very briefly. And I will hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Hiba. That was really helpful. I have a lot of notes. I just wanted to show one thing. This is different companies that sponsor visas, and it shows the number of filings, and you can see that the large companies are the ones doing the main H-1B visas within the lottery. And looking down through all of these, all of them hire statisticians and data scientists. And it goes down to a lower number pretty quickly. Okay, let's see. Xinyue, do you want to do the question and answer, or do you want me to field those?
Oh, hi, Mr. Mark. I think you can, like, for the student who have question, they can just ask. So that's
okay. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand, and Xinyue will unmute you and you can ask. So do we have any hands or questions? Okay, I guess I'll start out. I think there are some visas or things for world-class experts or different visas and stuff like that. Is that something that's common or available? And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I believe what you're referring to is something called the O1 visa. The O1 visa is for individuals who have, achieved extraordinary ability in their field. whether it's in, the sciences, arts, business, so on and so forth. And the evidentiary standard for a successful O1 is very, very high. One of the things that at times can prevent most students from qualifying for an O1 is the fact that they're still very much at the beginning of their careers and have not yet had as much professional experience because they've been going to school, like they've been studying, they've been getting their degree. And in order to qualify for an O1, you need to be able to show a number of, meet a number of evidentiary requirements, but I'm also going to say that it's not impossible. So there have been many instances in the past where we have worked with a student from another country who unfortunately reached the end of their OPT and then STEM EAD and participated in the H-1B lottery 3 times and just were never selected. But because of work that this person, these people did in their home countries, either maybe prior to enrolling in the graduate program in the United States, we were able to successfully argue an O1. So it is a option, but the evidentiary bar is quite high. Now, I believe Wenjing shared her story, and what she did was pursue a self-sponsored route in the form of something called a national interest waiver. And I thought that when we spoke and I heard that, I actually thought that it was a brilliant strategy, and I thought it was great that she did that. The one caveat I will make is I think that applying for a national interest waiver is something that is, like I said, a brilliant idea if you are able to successfully convert to H-1B status. You're working. And, maybe you can rely on some of that experience for purposes of filing a successful petition. While it's not impossible, I would say it might possibly be a bit more challenging to make the same argument if you are still in student status. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that you do connect with a lawyer and get assessed for eligibility, and not, close any doors, just make sure that you're kind of like exploring all options. So yeah, so to answer your question, Mark, there are more, there are multiple options that you could argue are based in the extraordinary abilities of the applicant or their, success and acclaim in their field or in their area of study that could potentially be available. But everyone who pursues these needs to be prepared to really put in the hard work in gathering the evidence required in order to successfully get an approval.
Okay. So when you're talking about it would be important to get your own lawyer to do that assessment or somebody through the company or either.
Yeah, either or both, I mean, it really also kind of depends on the lawyer, their experience with these sorts of applications, how much they've seen just anecdotally in terms of like filing a high volume of cases. Some lawyers tend to be very cavalier when it comes to filing these applications. Some lawyers tend to be very, very conservative, and they will not actually submit the application until they feel like they have like a slam dunk, so, the strategy also can differ from lawyer to lawyer, practitioner to practitioner. So when it comes to this type of case, it's probably not a bad idea to get more than one opinion. Maybe talk to the lawyer representing your company, and then maybe even go seek your own lawyer, but be very, very, very careful that you don't have a lawyer that gets like a little too carried away and says, oh yeah, don't worry, this will work, because of all of the filings, like of all of the visa types, I can say that like O1 is probably the most expensive, of the various different types of green card applications. EB1 is oftentimes the most expensive, so just be very careful.
All right, thank you. Okay, again, anybody in the audience have their questions? In fact, this is good practice, even if you think it, it's just something you don't understand, it may be worth asking, and other people may benefit too.
It looks like Paul has a question.
Yeah, I have a real quick question. For those, what's the most effective way for individuals to find like an immigration lawyer? I mean, besides just Googling it.
Yeah. So I don't want to say, so I don't want to sound self-serving, but so when it comes to some of like the larger, more established firms in the employer-sponsored immigration space, I would say that there's only 4 or 5 max. And I'm happy to provide that information, to anybody who wants it. But can I give you a little bit of an insider tip? So has everyone heard of Blind?
What's it called?
Blind, the app Blind.
BLIND.
Yeah, like Blind.
Yeah.
So it's an app that is only for like employees of companies, and the only way that you can join is if you enter in your company email address. But once you're in, you can actually get direct feedback and reviews from like thousands of other employees going through the same process you're going through, whether it's not immigration related and simply interviewing with a company, or whether it is immigration related and you're just kind of like vetting notes about, one company's immigration provider versus another. And that is, in my opinion, a very, very good way to get direct information from folks that have literally gone through like the same thing that you're going through. Like, so for example, like maybe you're getting ready to like consider an offer with a particular company and you want to like get some feedback on like what their immigration policies are like. So, if you start there anecdotally, you'll be able to kind of like see the same names for immigration providers like coming up over and over again. So that is another way. And then what I've been told from like a lot of clients is that there are a lot of like blogs and forums that oftentimes are also very kind of like community based. So I'm not 100% certain, but this is what I've been told after, several years of working with folks in the industry. Like, people from India might have their own forums or their own blogs that they follow regularly, people from China, people from, other countries. So those sorts of forums will also be additional sources. The American Immigration Lawyers Association website is also a source. That's going to be like more diverse though, because that organization is not very focused on employment-based. It's focused on all things immigration. So it'll have resources for everything from employment-based to family-based, marriage-based, asylum, deportation, removal, like that sort of a thing. But that can also serve as a good resource. Or you can just email me.
Great, thanks.
All right. Thank you. Let's see, any other questions? Xiang and Wenjing, do you have any further thoughts and comments after Hiba talked?
I think the forum is really helpful. And one thing I also did get help with the acquaintances I know, like my coworkers, someone actually might have gone through the similar process, and they have their attorneys. So there's a direct contact you can get. So you can reach out to the attorney and have the attorney to evaluate your case.
All right. Thank you. And Xinyue, let's see. Oh, Xiang also put the team blind in the chat, so you can pull that off. Let's see. Does anybody on the panel have any further questions? Okay, I mean, I think we've had a tremendous amount of information. I just wanted to thank a few people. I'm sorry, I'm just doing on the screen. And so one, aside from our panel, we had I had a lot of help from the career services and alumni services. Associate Vice Provost Kelly Bishop came back to me quickly with informative answers and stuff like that. And I think that says a lot about how career and alumni services, helps out you as students in the university. And there were several other people, Musa Fuhr, Camelia Lopez, and Alexander Washington, and Paul, who's here, that helped me out with information. Also, too, Hiba is part of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and when I happened to walk by their office coming from GW, they, took my request for getting somebody, and I got 12 lawyers that were willing to talk. And I don't know if that would be a source of lawyers either, but Hiba was the first, and she also had the connection with GW teaching in the law school. And so thank you for a very informative presentation. So given that, we've gone a little over the hour, and so thank you very much for coming.